In Racing Through Time, we look at the famous drivers, the cars, the circuits and the races that have made motorsport history. John Surtees will always be known as the first and only driver to have won road racing world championships on both 2 and 4 wheels. Driving for Ferrari provides a unique insight into how the famous Italian team works. In the 1930s, great drivers like Nuvolari, Varzi and Rosemeyer started their racing careers on motorbikes. By 1950, when the World Championship began, most of the drivers came from a car racing background. There were some exceptions. Alberto Ascari and Piero Turuffi did have motorcycle experience. Although Britain's world champion Jeff Duke was tempted towards cars, antagonism from some drivers and contractual problems adversely affected what could have been a great four-wheeled career. It was left to a much more forceful and self-confident two-wheel champion to prove that the move from bikes to cars was possible. The dream of winning world championships in both categories of racing was achieved by John Surtees. In Racing Through Time, John Surtees tells his own story. How did his career start?
I suppose just looking at magazines during the war years, when we were evacuated, having been bombed out. And then, immediately after the war, my father sort of piled my brother, sister and myself into a dicky seat of a big old Ford V8 car, fixed this three-wheel device behind, which was a 596 Norton and sidecar, and off we went to Cadwell Park. And that was the first motorcycle race I ever saw. Mind you, I mean, there's pictures of me being carried around in the pits down at Brands Hatch and Lamb's Farm, two grass tracks in those days, but my first race was directly after the war, seeing father race his cycle outfit. Then I had my first race at 15 years of age with a Excelsior B14 Jap. Fell off on every corner, actually. It set quite a record that day, I think. Whereupon father said, I think that's too big for you. So I ended up then with a little 250 Tiger 70 Triumph that was purchased from Harold Daniels, a very famous TT rider. And that cost, I think, £8 or £9. So my pocket money didn't sort of go far. And I raced that on a few grass tracks, and in 1950 I made it into a road racer and took part in the first road race at Brands Hatch, and that was the start of my career. The following year I built a Vincent up. I was an apprentice at Vincent HRD company, and I started winning with that, and winning with that took me to Norton's. From Norton's I went on to MV Agusta, and from MV Agusta I carried on until the end of 1960, when I retired at the age of 26 from motorcycling.
Surtees won 7 world titles, all with MV Agusta. He was 500cc world champion in 1956, 58, 59 and 1960, and 350cc world champion in 58, 59 and 60. John's driving style evolved, not surprisingly, from his motorcycle riding style. Forged in the days of push starts, drum brakes and narrow cross-ply tyres, this was a tight and tidy, economical way of using limited grip to best advantage, using precise gear changes and braking points to maintain high in-corner speed. This natural tidiness rewarded him well in a Formula One car, where much higher levels of grip had to be balanced with very much more power. By setting up the car to suit his unspectacular style, he was able to go quickly without stressing or unbalancing the car, and the result was lower fuel consumption, tyre wear and mechanical failures. John Surtees also won 6 Isle of Man Tourist Trophy races on the famed 37 3/4 mile road racing circuit, riding MVs.
I got a little disillusioned towards the end of the 50s because I loved racing, and MVs started to restrict me in the number of events I could take part in. They stopped me riding in the national events here in England at Silverstone, Scarborough, Aintree, Brands Hatch and races like that, and said, you will do the World Championship events. Well, that only amounted to about 9 500 races and 9 350 races. And I didn't consider that enough, either to continue my own development as a rider or the development of the machines. And so by chance, I met up with Tony Vandervelde, Mike Hawthorne, and Reg Parnell at a Sportsman of the Year presentation in Park Lane. And they said, come on, you should try a race car. 4 wheels are much easier than 2. You know, they stand up, they don't fall over so easy. I didn't give it any more thought. And then just after that meeting, of course, Mike got killed. And then suddenly out of the blue, I had a call from Reg Parnell, and this was I think the beginning of 60. He said, come down and try a car. And so I went down and I tried an Aston Martin DBR1, I think, the sports car, which in fact had been the sports car that Stirling Moss had won with at the Nürburgring. And I drove it. And Reg Parnell said, sign here, there's a contract for you. I said, don't be silly, you know, I've never seen a car race. You know, it's the first time I'd sit in a race car, but I'd never seen a car race. And he said, no, we want you to drive for us. I said, no, I'm a motorcycle rider. And then Reg Parnell, then Vandervelde came on, and Tony said, what you driving? That heap of, I won't use the rest of the words, as you can guess what Tony said. I'll bring you down a Grand Prix car. So sure enough, down came the van wool, and he'd brought the van wools out of cotton wool, and there were these fabulous cars, you know, the real, I suppose Tony Vandervelde was the person who started the whole English racing scene going again after the war. He was certainly the leader of the renaissance of British motor racing. And I was given these cars, and I just went round and round Goodwood in them. Well, that led to Ken Tyrrell offering me a drive in a Formula Junior in order to get my license. I thought, well, if I'm going to learn something about cars, I'd better learn it fairly quickly. So I went out and bought a Formula 2 car from Cooper's. I did my first race in a Formula Junior, my second race and came second. My second race in a Formula 2 came second. My third race in a Formula 2 and came second. And I think my fourth race in a Formula 1 at the British Grand Prix, because Colin Chapman had come along and said, we want you to drive a Formula 1 car. I tested it at Silverstone. Had an abortive start at Monaco because the gearbox broke. But I started at the British Grand Prix and I finished second in it. And in between this, I was putting my leathers on and racing the bikes as well. So it was quite an exciting year, 1960. I was supposed to join Lotus for 1961. And Colin had given me the choice of who I would have as a teammate. And I had chosen Jimmy Clark. But then a great big political storm blew up around Innes Island, who was the existing #1 driver for Lotus. And I'd been so sick, frankly, of all the politics that I'd encountered when I'd entered motorsport, that I just washed my hands of it and went off and signed for Yeoman Credit and Reg Parnell. In a way, I suppose, I sort of went and tried to find a little haven where I thought that I could have a little support. But then I also believed that we were going to have official Works Cooper cars. It was going to be a second team. But when we got there, for whatever reasons, it didn't turn out that way. And we ended up with standard production Coopers. And so for that reason, I suggested that we should develop a research car, try and make it better and to compete with the Works. And that's what we did. And it wasn't particularly successful, frankly. We made lots of mistakes, but these things are not a short term. And in the following year, we did build their first Lola car together with Eric Broadley. Well, Eric Broadley built the car, and Yeoman Credit brought Lolas into Grand Prix racing. And again, that was very quick, and it just suffered from the fact that it was fairly underfinanced, and also it was in its first year. But it certainly frightened all the big established teams, because we were certainly, while it was going, more than competitive on speed. And of course, we very nearly got the German Grand Prix, and in a number of events we were very much there, but we did have quite a lot of silly problems, which are all partly the coming together of a team. To put something all together in a short while, in a matter of those 2 seasons, was too much, and it was a mistake for my part to go to a new team. I should have perhaps swallowed some of my pride and probably stayed with Colin, because certainly I would have had the most competitive machine. And I'd very nearly won a couple Grand Prix in the odd outings I'd had the previous year. But that wasn't to be, and who knows, Colin's cars didn't stay together very well, so I might not have been here today if I had done. Well, at the end of 1962, there was doubts about the continuing finance of the Lola team, which we'd started, whether Yeoman Credit Bowmaker would continue or not. And I was also looking for something which kept all 4 wheels on. Ferrari at least had a reputation of being very soundly constructed. And I was rather interested in trying for the very first time a sports car, because I'd never driven a sports car at all. So Ferrari asked me to go there. I went out there, and we started virtually a new team at Ferrari. Folgeri had been there before, but he hadn't had any real position within the team, because there'd been Keaty and company who had done all the previous seasons in the 1.5 litre formula. And I went to Ferrari to drive a sports car and to develop a new Formula One, because they'd been terribly uncompetitive in the previous year. And it was a whole new team, apart from people like Salvarani and Rocky, who were the real original engineers behind everything which had happened at Ferraris for about 10 years. Great characters and tremendous engineers. And gradually we tested and we put together the Formula One V6 car and the V12 engined sports cars. And I went out and we won our first sports car race, which was very nice, at Sebring, and Nürburgring, the 1,000 kilometres. And the Formula One car worked quite well. It was down on overall performance on the Climax engines, but we worked hard, and I was able to win my first Grand Prix that year at Nürburgring, where the help of a strong car and a usable car, and the Nürburgring, the old circuit, it all sort of equalled things up, and I was able to win. And so that augured well for the following year. But Ferrari in those days, of course, was its own worst enemy, because it was terribly political as a company, and it also had to balance the sports car racing program against the Formula One program. And so you never had a full year of effort take place into a particular formula. The Formula One program would stop from September through to round about June, apart from just a little work going on, because all the work would be going into the sports cars so that Le Mans could be contested. That was the way it was. I know later on I became rather unpopular because I said that they ought to hive off the sports car program. Much as I loved driving the prototype cars, it was impossible to do Formula One properly if they were going to do prototype cars as well. The company just couldn't cope. But I had quite a good year, really. It was a very happy year. I was back in Italy and I enjoyed working at Ferrari, and at last I'd sort of come home. You can only go by the record book. But there is no reason we had the material there and the ability at Ferrari. There's no reason why Ferrari could not have tied the World Championship up in 64, 65, 66, and for sure 67. We had all the ingredients and we had the beating of the others, but the very nature of Ferrari and the antics that the Commendatore got up to at times and the general character of the company meant that you weren't really fighting the opposition, but half the time you were sort of fighting the internal forces. 64, yes. We had a 6-cylinder, we had an 8-cylinder, there's an engine sitting in this room actually, an 8-cylinder, and we had a 12-cylinder, all Formula One, 1.5 litres. None of them except the 12 produced as much power as the Coventry Climax. You know, people have talked about for years about, you know, Ferrari power. But the main thing that I recall in my period at Ferraris is that in fact we got cars which were very drivable and could be driven very hard indeed and would hang together. But the main thing, apart from 2 occasions, was that we always lacked power. And that's something which certainly the journalists never latched on to. And certainly power characteristics, because what power we did have was always at the top of the power range. But the actual 64 season, it started off typical, where no work had been done, and although we got the 8-cylinder there, it wasn't producing the right amount of power, and we had lots of troubles. Once Le Mans was over, it started to work. And of course I was able to repeat my win at the Nürburgring, and then win at Monza, and I was leading and should have won in Austria, but that the front suspension link broke there, one of the very few breakages. But and then we got to ending up the championship where we had this race in Mexico. The race started in that I could have either taken the 12 or the 8. The 12 by that stage was going considerably faster than the 8 on occasions, but we had 2 big problems: fuel consumption and oil consumption. The fuel consumption wasn't a problem for Mexico because, of course, with the altitude you could lean the mixture right up, and so it wasn't a problem. And so but we decided, for safety's sake, that I had to use the 8. And we started a race with it misfiring, something which was probably due to them having leaned it up a little too much to try and get the optimum mixture and power output. And for a couple laps or so, it sort of didn't work. And by this stage, you had, I think, as Clark and Gurney, and there was Bandini and Graham. Well, I picked up on Bandini and Graham, and they were having a great dice. And what I saw was that these two were dicing away, and the main place to pass was going into the banked hairpin. I honestly think that Graham made a mistake and left the door open and tried to close it too late, and that was it. But it was a natural enough mistake, considering that suddenly he had this other car appear, which in turn was me. And I was the one he was really racing against. He didn't have to race against Bandini. It was unfortunate, because frankly I would much rather have passed him and got it rather than have things said.
John Surtees won the 1964 World Championship by just 1 point from Graham Hill, with Jim Clark third. Surtees was also battling the complicated world of Ferrari politics. They had the technology, the finance, and in John Surtees, they had a driver who should have had even more success.
We should have just walked it. We should have walked the championship. We had a car there which only once ever had a real chance to show its true potential. And that was for a few laps at the Grand Prix of Italy in 1965, when the flat 12 was actually sort of given to us in its final form. And we went out, and for the few laps that it actually ran properly, before the clutch thrust race went, I was able to play with the opposition. But politics came in the game. And during the winter, Ferrari was trying to sell the project and a few other things, perhaps even the company, to Fiat. And so it wasn't politically possible to dispense with the 8 and put all the attentions into 12, because the 8 might be the engine that they sell to Fiat and all sorts of things like this. So again, you had the three-way sort of program going, where you had a bit of work on the 8 and a bit of work on the 12 and a bit of work on the sports car, prototype cars for Le Mans, whereas of course everybody else was working on trying to win one particular type of racing, either Formula One or prototypes. And it's perhaps because of Ferrari having to juggle the figures to keep the firm alive financially. Perhaps I do him an injustice, but certainly from the point of view of gaining success, it wasn't the right program.
The T70 Lola, which John helped develop, was a direct descendant of the Lola GT Coupe. This design was bought by Ford and turned into the GT40 after the breakdown in negotiations to purchase Ferrari. John raced against the Lola.
Yes, and of course this became the main opposition car when the Fords took it over against the Ferrari. So I got involved again with Eric, partly because I thought we were falling so far behind at Ferrari. That may sound rather strange, but Ferrari was like, he ruled it rather like a little feudal kingdom. And at that stage, there was only one real manufacturer in Italy, which was Ferrari. Whereas back in here, in England, you had Brabham and you had Cooper and you had McLaren, you had all these teams, all working together. The knowledge was leaked from here to there, and test was going on, and each one was doing like a piggyback on top of the other in their R&D. And we out at Ferrari were going along steady at our old pace, a bit of work on a prototype and a bit of work on a Formula One. And I thought, well, we are losing touch. And so I asked Ferrari, I said, can I go along and perhaps drive a sports car? He first of all said, well, try one of ours, see if it's going to be any competitive. So he gave me a prototype car, which we took a few pieces off, and I took off to America. And apart from when it rained, when I was able to sort of see them off, the big American engine chaparrals and things just blew it off. There was no way it could compete either on power. It was at the end of 1965, my year when we should have won again the Formula One championship, if we'd sort of just kept our nose to the grindstone and used what we had in the factory, that I had my most horrendous accident, which was when I took over the car that Jackie Stewart was due to drive at Mosport, another T70. And it lost a wheel, which later transpired to be that someone had made a mistake and fitted a faulty part onto the suspension. But it lost a wheel and the car, I don't recall any of this, went off a track and rolled over a few times and dropped on me and caused a relatively large amount of damage. And I sort of woke up some time later in hospital. And of course that stopped me having any further rides in the 1.5 litre 12 that had been so competitive at Monza. I lost out on the American Grand Prix and the Mexican Grand Prix in '65. And it wasn't until I went out to the factory again, having been released from St Thomas's. They sort of put me all together again after a spell of hospital in Toronto. I was a little shorter on one side, but just apart from that, Ferrari had rang me up in hospital and said, which leg is it? So I said, well, it's mainly the sort of left leg. Oh, that's okay then. We'll make you an automatic if you've got any trouble. That was the attitude. So they, in fact, rigged up one of their engine cranes so they could lift me in and out the car when I went back to start testing of the new 3 litre car, which was a terrible disappointment when I saw it. I thought that here with the 3 litre formula was the time when we would just disappear. But unfortunately, I think budget restrictions and other things had caused them to do a big compromise and to utilise basically a sports car engine. They virtually ran their engine, which they had developed for the Le Mans race, in a shorter stroke version for the Formula One. And we ended up with a 3 litre engine, which had about 280 horsepower. And I know that you even had things like the Repco able to sort of go by it down the straight in its initial races. But still, I started my testing or my convalescence driving in the little 2.4, because in the winter of 1965 I had been due to go to New Zealand and Australia to do the Tasman series, and so we had put a 2.4 engine into a V6 engine into a Formula One chassis, and this had made a super little car. And in fact that car was about 2 seconds a lap faster around Modena than the new 3 litre Formula One car. However, I had to drive a 3 litre Formula One car. And although the other car was much more suitable for Monaco, etc., the team manager, Mr. Dragoni, refused to let me use it. I said, but surely we must put before everything else the fact that we want to win the race. He said, yes, but Ferrari make 12 cylinders. so you must drive a 12. In fact, what it was part of a scheme he was putting together where he was trying to promise many in the Italian Federation, and also, I believe, Mr. Agnelli, that he could create a Ferrari team that would win with Italian drivers. And so from then onwards, he kept on pretending that my physical condition was affecting my driving. Well, he was very disappointed when I came back and jumped into the sports car, or the prototype car, for the first time, and in pouring wet rain won the 1,000 kilometres at Monza, and then won Syracuse. But he was rather heartened by the fact that Jack beat me at Silverstone. He could go back and say, well, it shouldn't have happened, despite the fact that we didn't have any power. And he was even more disheartened when I actually won the Grand Prix at Belgium. May sound strange, but he actually was disheartened. However, after that, and because of the problems of Monaco, I had a meeting with Mr. Ferrari and said, look, either we are going to go racing to win races and to use whatever it takes to win that race, and let's forget the politics, or else I am leaving. I didn't have anywhere else to go, and this was mid-season, and I was leading the World Championship. But Mr. Ferrari was in a very political position. He was deeply involved now with Fiat. Dragoni was deeply involved in those negotiations. And so it ended up I went. And of course I joined my old teammate, Roy Salvadori. And in fact I moved virtually just down the road, and there I was working away at Maserati to try and get their engine better. And I joined Jochen Rindt in the Cooper team for the rest of the season. And again, the rest of the season turned out to be ifs and buts, because in fact we ended up winning the Mexican Grand Prix with it, and only just missed out on the World Championship. And that was only due to, again, those things that happen in races, one or two silly mechanical failures.
Surtees was an important acquisition for Cooper. Team manager Roy Salvadori started the season knowing that American Richie Ginther was only a temporary solution to their driver lineup, alongside Jochen Rindt. The veteran Londoner was thinking that he might have to drive himself, often listed as a reserve. Surtees' chances weren't helped by Cooper's tyre contract, but his contribution to the sorting out of this somewhat overweight car was important. John's tactical and technical experience was as vital to the team as his driving ability.
I changed the ignition system in conjunction with the Maserati engineers, Alfieri, over to the same system as we used on the Ferrari, because it was all experience I'd had, and that made it work a little better, made it pull a little better. And we also changed the suspension around a little, and we did use at times Firestone tyres. To counter this, of course, Ferrari came out, and this was what they had been hoping for. They came out with an engine which had a further 50 horsepower, which was the new 3-valve engines. And the whole theme of Mr. Dragoni's promise to Mr. Ferrari and to Mr. Agnelli was that with the sort of power that Ferrari were going to get out of their new engine, they didn't need to have a top driver. Lorenzo, who was a top driver, mind you, would be quick enough. One thing for sure is that I had the highest respect possible for Lorenzo, a very much underrated driver, and one which Ferrari put in an impossible position because Lorenzo never wanted the responsibility of being a number one. I'm not suggesting that that was the reason for his accident, but he was virtually in tears asking me to stay on when I left later on in 1966. I had a great affection for Lorenzo. He was a good driver and certainly good for Italian sport. Well, I'm not going to go into all the wheres and wherefores of what happened then, and particularly the personal piece between Mr. Ferrari and myself. That's something which was personal, and we said at that time, and he's never said anything, and I've never said anything. But Bandini was certainly not involved in it at all. Parks, Scaffiotti and Dragoni were.
The Mexican Grand Prix saw the debut of the new Formula One Honda in the hands of American Richie Ginther. John always liked to build a team around him, as he proved with Lola and Ferrari. He knew he had engineering, organisational and driving talent. Perhaps the challenge of a new team played its part when he announced that he was joining Honda.
Well, I had to decide what to do for 1967. 1966 had been a great disappointment because there was again a world championship in our hands, and for various reasons it all fell apart. And Jack did a very sound, practical program and of course drove extremely well and won the world championship. Was I to stay with Cooper Maserati? Well, in rather typical fashion, they didn't know whether they would have a budget or whether they would race, and in those days, of course, one wasn't talking about millions of pounds for budgets. One was talking about probably having something like £100,000 to run a Formula One team with, if you were lucky. But they weren't sure. And I was approached in Mexico by Mr. Nakamura, who said that they wanted to continue racing, but they were rather difficult on budget. They couldn't run a two-car effort. So I thought about this, and after the disappointment of leaving Ferrari, because I had began to look upon as Ferrari as being my home. I'd looked upon probably being with Ferrari forevermore. And when that all sort of fell apart, I was frankly wanting to become part of another team and another family. And I thought, they must be able to get it right. They've done this in motorcycling, they must be able to do it. This is the place to go. I suppose I should have looked around and said, what is the car most likely to win? That's a car which by hook or by crook I should get myself into. Instead, I went together with Honda. Well, there was no setup, nothing at all. They had two cars, one narrow track, one wide track, and 3.5 engines. That was what was there. And what became apparent was that it was a fairly low-key effort, partly because there were certain budget restrictions. I hadn't been totally aware of this, although Mr. Nakamura had said that they couldn't run a two-car team. They had to restrict it to one top-line driver and someone who would give them assistance in developing not only the cars, but generally their experience of Grand Prix racing. open doors for them and keep in contact with many of the accessory manufacturers, something which in fact I'd done for Ferrari. And Honda wanted some indication as to whether it's worthwhile modifying the engine. We'd hoped that they would build a new engine which would save all the weight and reduce the size. But they said that if we could demonstrate that we could improve the chassis, they would at least go along with redeveloping the engine. So engineer Sarno and assistant came over, got together with Eric Broadley and I think it was Tony Southgate. A basic Indianapolis type chassis was modified and worked on. A lot of the components were made in Japan and flown over, and the whole thing came together just before Monza. The engine was fitted, we trundled off to Monza, and of course we won the race. Just.
Dramatic.
It was a dramatic scramble and sort of an outfoxing job on the last corner with Jack Brabham. And we'd have been somewhat fortunate in that Jimmy had been considerably quicker, but he'd run into mechanical problems. And so it was left down to Jack and me to fight it out on the last corner. And luckily, Jack's actual aggressiveness and competitiveness on this occasion worked against him, and he took the sort of semi-bait that I offered him, because I had the option of going in and blocking his corner by going up the inside line but getting onto the oil, or going down the outside and leaving the inside with the oil and cement on it, and hoping that if he did take the chance that it would mean him getting into a little trouble. And luckily this is what happened, because from the actual exit of the curve up to the start line, Jack was quicker than me. And so if he'd actually sort of really sat tight behind me, he could have hit me by the start line. But luckily, that open space up the inside was too much of a temptation. And I think perhaps if I'd been in his position, I would have been tempted to do it as well. But it was great encouragement to Hondas, and of course to myself. And the Ferrari had been defeated on its home ground, and by myself. And in fact, I think the Italians just went mad. They were so enthusiastic. It just goes to show, quite how involved the Italians can get with people. And I was extremely heartened to see that they still looked upon me as virtually one of them. But valuable years as a racing driver, now looking back, were passing by. And I suppose 1968 is a little bit like the rest of those years of what might have been. For instance, although the car was very heavy, the engine now, with its new torsion bar valve springs, was able to be quite safely revved. And although it didn't have a particularly good torque, if you geared it down for the shorter circuits, it still had a relatively good performance. And this showed up where we were going extremely well and leading the Monaco Grand Prix. And what happened is that one of the new, rather inexperienced team of mechanics that had come in had not put the pin into the reverse gear, and the reverse gear fell out. At the same time, we were leading the Belgium Grand Prix very comfortably, with it going like a bomb. And this time, it was part that had been manufactured in England. The weld around one of the rear suspension pivot, lower wishbone pins, broke away. The new V12 hadn't appeared, but what had appeared was an air-cooled 8-cylinder engine and chassis. Extremely light car. They'd gone from one extreme to the other. Well, I had the machine to test at Silverstone, and after about 2 laps, the engine just wouldn't run properly, and it was obviously something which just didn't work. The engineers, although being extremely loyal, had virtually sort of told me that it wasn't their idea and that they didn't think it would work. But after a couple of tests, I said, look, this is a waste of time. Well, one night someone came in and the car was taken out of the workshop. And the next time it appeared was when we got to France, and we suddenly found that the car was there and going to be driven by Slessor. And of course in that race he had that horrific accident and was killed driving that car. And I think the loss of face by the car not working, plus this horrendous accident, was the final straw.
Moving on from the Japanese team, John drove briefly for BRM in 1969, an unsatisfactory association.
Less said about it, the better. Obviously at one stage, when they had had very competitive cars in the 1.5 litre period, things somehow had worked. There were some clever people there. For instance, there was Peter Wright, who I think should be credited with probably doing the first ground effect cars or chassis in latter years. And he at that time was doing drawings of that type of thing. The only thing is that first and foremost they had to put together a team again, because many of the old people had left. If they just put together a practical, safe car, which all hung together, there was a chance of getting success, because actually the V12 engine was quite a fine engine, but it was all a little too late for them. And the main problem was, again, politics and the squabbling, which took place particularly behind the scenes between Sir Alfred Owen and Louis Stanley. And so we were back to square one and decided, well, in future, for better or for worse, we'll make our own decisions. We had virtually no money, but we'd made a few Formula 5000 cars, which had been quite successful. We'd won the British and the American championships. As I said, right, well, we'll build a Formula 1 car.
John Surtees followed in the wheel tracks of Jack Brabham and Bruce McLaren as drivers who became constructors. Surtees' Grand Prix cars raced from 1970 through to 1978. The best result was Mike Halewood's second place at Monza in 1972. Health problems and the increasing financial burden of operating a Formula One team led to Surtees closing his team in 1978.
We got involved with what was going to be our first main sponsor, Bang & Olufsen. But they never paid, and we never really recovered from it. We moved out the factory, we scaled ourselves down, and then I had a reoccurrence of a problem health-wise which put me into St Thomas's. I was not around. I was 16 weeks for one period and then a further period in hospital. And so I decided, because I wasn't out there fighting for sponsorship, I just decided to close it. And so we closed it.
John Surtees is held in such high regard by Mercedes-Benz that he's entrusted to drive their precious cars in modern demonstrations, such as the Goodwood Festival of Speed. He still rides bikes in demonstration events, his smooth style unchanged from the early years. Other drivers who have had success changing from 2 to 4 wheels include Mike Hailwood, Wayne Gardner and Eddie Lawson. Of today's riders, MotoGP champion Valentino Rossi tried his hand at World Championship rallying, although it only lasted 2 stages. All these riders are still chasing the unique place that John Surtees holds in the history of motorsport.